Hello, Booktube. It's been a while since we talked. It's been about 6 to 8 months or something like that. I'm sorry if you were missing me, but not many people are subscribed, so maybe it's okay to take a long break like that. I was waiting on a number of factors. For one thing, I wanted to get a better mic before I continued, which I've got a better mic now. Unfortunately, I don't have my webcam at the moment, so you're gonna have to trade in worse video quality for better audio quality, which is a pretty good trade-off, to what I understand. I've read about 20 something books in the intervening time, good 20 something, probably more than that. Some of them are kind of big, and I'm here to talk to you about the one that I most recently finished. Yeah, I'm sorry about this bad background, but again, I don't have my webcam, so I'm going to have to use the front-facing camera on my laptop. But hopefully, this will cover up some of the ugly apartment that's in the background. Maybe it should cover up the window. No. No, the ugly fridge. Anyway, this was what I read. The White Company by Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle, popular for Sherlock Holmes, mostly The Lost World, also, and not much else. Sherlock Holmes is nothing to sneeze at, though, of course. He is an immortal character. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't care much for him, Sherlock Holmes. He thought everything else he ever did was more important than him. And, of course, he tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes multiple times. Only once, actually. And then had to bring him back through popular demand in the, I like to imagine, sarcastically called The Return of Sherlock Holmes series. Anyway, this is one of the books that he considers more important, most important, in fact. He thought that this was a book that he had the most fun writing and also meant something to him. As you can see in this little introduction that he's written, or this dedication, to the hope of the future, the reunion of the English-speaking races, this little chronicle of our common ancestry is inscribed. South Norwood, September 29th, 1891. So yeah, you can see Arthur Conan Doyle is putting his all into this book. At least that's what he's saying. But this is a good example of when that doesn't necessarily make a better book. It's not bad. It's not terrible. It's very enjoyable. It can be considered good, but it's very indulgent. Anyway, I should probably get on to the summary. It's about a young monk named Aileen Edrickson. He's like 20-something young Saxon blonde-haired male who spent his life in a monastery. Naturally, he's very sheltered, very God-fearing. At age 20, he decides to go out into the real world and experience it and all of its iniquities and joys and horrors. And he soon discovers it is a horrifying world because this is the medieval times, is about the 1300s, takes place during the Hundred Years' War, and what was probably then referred to as the Dark Ages, although that's not really the right term for the medieval era. And he soon encounters all kinds of violence and all kinds of things that make him lose faith in humanity. But he buddies up with this little company of archers, a free company, sort of mercenaries, called the White Company. And, during this time, the 1300s, there were lots of mercenary companies in Europe. A lot of them were considered fearful bands of rogues who would terrorize, do whatever they wanted. Some of them were good of heart. The ones in this book are much better of heart. But they are depicted as having vices as well as virtues, of course. And that's about it. For most of the book, Aileen Edrickson is taken into their company as a monk because they say they want a monk on the battlefield to shrive the people who die, but he doesn't really do that in this book. I'm not really sure what his position in the company is. It's not represented very well. For a while, he becomes a tutor to the daughter of Sir Nigel Loring, who is the leader of this free company. And a little comes of that, not much. Of course, he falls in love with her. But for most of this book, it seems like Alien Edrickson is a little bit in the background. It's mostly just about the men in this company and their interactions with each other. There, so many of these pages are just talking, talking, talking between the members of this group, and it's all in faux medieval English. Maybe it's a bit more accurate than that, but it still comes across very book. It's very novelistic talking. It's not very natural. Everybody has like a paragraph at the ready and a ton of like qualifiers to their words and tons of like clever little witticisms. It is extremely like when you picture an old medieval movie or an old medieval novel, this is what it's like. All the characters talk like that. And Alien Edrickson just kind of blends into the background, which characterizes him a little bit. He's probably the innocent youth who's just observing everything around him. But the main problem with this book I found is that a lot doesn't happen. There's just an awful lot that's not happening in this book. I read, just for context, there is a prequel to this book called Sir Nigel, written after this, of course, and I actually read that book first. That was a Christmas gift from my sister. Thank you, sister. And I like that book. There's a lot of action in it, a lot more compared to this. So when I read this for the first time, I was expecting a lot of, sea battles and castle sieges and all that. There is some of that in here, but not that much. There's a sea battle in the first 100 pages or so against some pirates. There's a couple sword fights between friendly characters and a joust with a mysterious black knight that doesn't really amount to anything. And then there's a castle siege, sieged by peasants. That's sort of a one-off scene. And that scene was extremely fun when it happened, but I also found it to be a little much. And then at the end there's the final battle, of course. But between all of those there's about 300 pages of characters moving from one location to another and talking with a character, and that's about it. Like, there's about 35 chapters in this book. Whenever I was done with a chapter, 9 times out of 10, I said to myself, what really happened in that chapter? And usually the answer was just they talked to some artist that they met, and then they went back home. And that was about it. It's definitely a big problem in this book. It's very accurate. Conan Doyle did a lot of research for this book. And that definitely comes across. It definitely comes across like he did a bunch of research because there's a bunch of anecdotes about history and a bunch of characters that represent different kinds of professions. Like you have a couple of flagellants. You have artists that refer to other artists. You have monks that refer to literature and all that. But it definitely comes across as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle being a little too indulgent. He's writing down everything he knows, everything he wants to happen is in there, and he doesn't have any discretion going back and cutting out what's not really important. Because he thinks, no, this is all gold. This is all good. Keep it in there. Those horrible people at the Strand magazine wouldn't let me write a bunch of guff into Sherlock Holmes because those are just tiny little stories. But here I get to write whatever I want. Back off. Yeah, that's sort of the feeling here. And it's very bad. That isn't very good. It's a pretty toxic mindset to have as a writer. You gotta tighten things up at a certain point. I mean, if it's interesting, you get to keep it in. But at a point you reach critical mass where too much interesting random anecdotes just take away from the book as a whole. This whole thing feels very flabby. it needs to be tightened up. This could be 200 pages, not 400. But it does come to a very good end, though. I did like the ending. It was a very somewhat patriotic end, showing a typical like last stand battle in which our heroes come out victorious. Although I will admit, the ending is a little too happy for what I expected. I was I swore that at least half of the characters, if not most of them, were going to die by the end of this book. And if that happened, then I would have given it extra credit. But nobody died. Which, I mean, I don't usually want to criticize a book for not killing any of the characters, but in this case, it would have really been deserved, I think, if at least somebody died. Pretty much every character lives. It's except for all the unnamed characters. And that's it's a little bit of a cop out, I think. It just because it was this bloody, deadly battle, and the entire company gets wiped out. Spoilers. Except for all the named characters, so it's like it didn't even happen. So I just want to prepare you for that, I guess. Spoilers, by the way. Uh, that being said, though, the happy parts of the happy ending were very good. Especially like the reunion of the main character and his love interest was very nice to read. Let me read you the last lines because I think it sort of shows the way Conan Doyle was thinking about this book as he was writing it. So they lived, these men, in their own lusty, cheery fashion, rude and rough, but honest, kindly, and true. Let us thank God if we have outgrown their vices. Let us pray to God that we may ever hold their virtues. The sky may darken, and the clouds may gather, and again the day may come when Britain may have sore need of her children. On whatever shore of the sea they be found, shall they not muster at her call? The end. That definitely shows how Conan Doyle thought he was writing something very important with this book. You can imagine, like, that's the end of a symphony, and there's like this epic, almost melodramatic crescendo as he's saying that. And right afterwards, the whole crowd cheers as the curtains go up and the list of players come out. Maybe it's a little much, but there's also a little bit of well, the last image you're left on is all the characters in the tavern that they're at the beginning of the book, drinking, carousing, shooting arrows, laughing, and then that description comes in. It kind of feels like because all of a sudden the book goes from talking exclusively about the period to suddenly narrating as if it's from the modern day. So it's like suddenly this whole book turns into a painting and it's zooming out and you're just looking at that painting and you're suddenly like sucked out of that period and back into yours. And that's kind of a good feeling to elicit at the end of a historical novel like this one, I think, which is all about patriotism and sort of all about patriotism. That theme definitely runs through this. And speaking of patriotism, this book was very influential in that respect. It was very popular when it came out, of course, and it kept popularity all the way through World War II. In fact, during World War II, there was a lot of paper shortages in Britain, and the British government apparently made sure that this book was still in print despite the paper shortages because they saw it as a nationally important work that would increase morale through the Second World War for Britain. Today it's mostly forgotten, and I don't really blame anybody for forgetting it because there's a lot of boredom here, and it is a little cheesy, but it is still very entertaining. It's very accurate to the period. There aren't very many books or pieces of media that care about historical accuracy anymore. So I think it would be nice if people read this once in a while. something like this. Although I might honestly read Sir Nigel again, but reading this book does make me want to go back to Sir Nigel because it seemed more action packed. But perhaps it shares a lot of the same problems as this does, and I just didn't identify them the first time I read it. I'm not sure. But I had some fun with this. This was a decent book. I feel like it wasted my time though a bit. Something I'm in I'm going to college right now. I'm going to classes and a book that's about 400 pages like this during classes, it took me about 2 weeks to finish at my reading speed, which may seem like a long time, but I don't care. I don't care. Uh, so that's about it for today. Who would I recommend this book to? I think I'd recommend it to, well, fans of Arthur Conan Doyle will perhaps want to read this just so that they can have his complete bibliography under their belt. And people who are a fan of the period would probably get something out of this, I think. People who are fans of adventure stories, adventure literature, might find it a little lacking. This lovely N.C. Wyeth cover, by the way. That cover was made for of course, the Scribner's edition. Scribner's illustrated books that were all like these black hardcover books with N.C. Wyeth doing all of the covers and illustrations within. That's probably the last time that this had a major publication, and probably part of the reason why this Dover publication exists. N.C. Wyeth, whenever he illustrates a book, it sort of extends its relevancy by another couple of decades. Probably the same case for Paul Creswick's Robin Hood. But anyway, that's about all I have to say. I'm just checking my notes to see if I forgot to say anything. Nope, I said everything. Okay, I won't waste any more of your time. Okay, see you later, Booktube.